Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. We're so glad you've joined us today. I'm Elif Sarican, writer, editor, translator, and your host. At the Amargi Mosaic, we're piecing together conversations from Kurdistan and the Middle East, bringing you stories and insights you might not hear elsewhere. We're a grassroots funded media collective powered by journalists and academics who believe in independent voices, not corporate agendas. So whether you're here to learn, stay informed, or simply curious about the region, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow us at theamargi.com and all the social media platforms you see on your screen. Your support helps us grow and keep these conversations alive. Now, let's get started. So, I have with me today Amy Austin Holmes, Dr. Holmes. You teach at the Bush School of Government and Public Service in DC and serve as research professor of international affairs at George Washington University. You're the author of three books, including most recently, and the contents in which we'll touch on a little bit. Statelet of Survivors, the making of a semi-autonomous region in Northeast Syria, and you previously worked at the State Department on Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. Now, the area you've researched has been, to say the least, a very complex and complicated region of the world, particularly in the last decade, but obviously has been in the interest of many different powers for many, many decades, and arguably the past century, particularly after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And you've been traveling to Syria since 2015, which is now over a decade, and most recently visited at the end of 2024. So that's nearly a decade of field work in one of the world's most complex and layered regions in many senses of that term, actually. And in your book, you describe how Kurds, Syriacs, Armenians, and other minorities seized the opportunity when Assad's forces withdrew in 2012 to build something entirely new, and by themselves, for themselves. Having witnessed this experiment in self-governance evolve over nearly a decade, what fundamental changes have you observed? I imagine a lot has changed, and perhaps also in some areas not much has changed. And what I'm particularly interested is in terms of your observations around local society. So obviously, there's a lot of talk about the system of the administration and the people that have been building in Northeast Syria in a kind of macro sense, but on a societal level, what have you seen? What have you observed in terms of how society organizes itself and everyday governance and social structures?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So you're right. This has been a decade of research that I've done in the region. I traveled over the summer as well. So after the fall of the regime in Syria, I've been back twice, once in December, January, and then again this past summer. Um, but to go back to your question about the original purpose of my research or why I started this, this was January 2015 when the Battle of Kobani was still going on, and I traveled actually along the Turkish side of the Syrian border, um, and visited the town of Suruc, which is right across the border from Kobani, and I saw myself how Kurds were mobilizing to defend Kobani. And I visited some of the refugee camps in Turkey. Some of the camps I visited were actually run by the Turkish government, by the Assad organization. So they were hosting some Syrian refugees, but I also visited refugee camps which were run by, at the time, the HDP, so the Kurdish HDP party. And so this gave me, some an initial insight into the situation, both on the Turkish and Syrian side of the border, also regarding how the Turkish government was treating the Syrian refugees, as well as how the Kurdish HDP party in Syria was. running their camps in a very different way, which was much more open. I was able, in the Turkish refugee camp, for example, the one run by the Turkish government, I was able to enter the camp, but they told me that I wasn't allowed to ask any questions or talk to anyone or take any pictures. Whereas in the refugee camp run by the HDP, they said I could talk to anybody I wanted, take photos of anything I wanted. And so it was that was an initial sort of indication of how different the Kurdish political movement in Turkey and the Turkish government was approaching this question of the refugee crisis. But it also, of course, I was fascinated really by the women who were fighting against the Islamic State, and that's really why I started this, because I felt that some of the news media was fairly superficial, just kind of, sensationalizing these women, but not really asking much about them or their motivations. And so that's what I wanted to do with my survey, which I thought at the time would be a small side project, which I would finish quickly. Um, but it turned out to be a project that took over the next 10 years of my life. And so I was able to go in the summer of 2015 into Kobane after the Islamic State had been driven out of Kobane, which, as your viewers, I'm sure know, was really the beginning of the end of the Islamic State, because it was the first time they had been dealt a serious defeat. And that was because of, at the time, the YPG and YPJ. So the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, had not yet been created when I started this in June 2015. And I was really only interested in talking to the women. I didn't even try to interview or have any of the men in the YPG do my survey. Um, and I also realized that during that first visit that there were not just Kurdish women, but also Arab women that were part of the YPJ. And I so realized that, my own sort of misperceptions about what was happening needed to be more nuanced. And that's why I adapted the survey to ask about the ethnic background, because I had just assumed they were all Kurds, but that was not in fact true. So I adapted the survey questions to ask about their ethnic background, their religion, where they're from, their level of education, etc. And I went back almost every year for the next 6, 7 years to do this survey. And I was able to then eventually visit virtually all of the provinces in North and East Syria that came under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces. So about one third of Syria, when the caliphate was officially defeated in 2019 as a territorial caliphate, at that point, the SDF controlled an area, again, one third of the country, about the size of Croatia. So the territorial control increased dramatically over those 4 years. And so as the territory that they controlled increased, I had to also expand my survey into those areas. So I traveled to Arab majority areas like Tapka, Manbij, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and elsewhere to conduct my survey. And again, I realized that this is truly a multi-ethnic force where all of the ethnic and religious minorities in the region are represented. I also had a question about the tribal affiliation. And I found that there were 40, so the respondents to my survey indicated that they belonged to 46 different Arab tribes or sub-tribes, which represents all of the tribes in the region. So, in my view, the SDF has become the most representative armed force on the ground in Syria, more so than any other of the non-state armed actors. And there are many non-state armed actors in Syria. But that's my assessment. And so I became, fascinated by their by how they were able to defeat ISIS as they expanded and took on more and more people from more and more diverse backgrounds. But then I also became very fascinated by the governance structures. And I think that's what you were also asking me about, but that's sort of how I got into this project to begin with.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think the way that it seems like the way your research kind of developed and transformed over the space of, a decade or so, or just under a decade, is also the story of how the SDF and the SDC, the Syrian Democratic Council, which is, the political governing body, also transformed its not only its territory but also the way in which it approached the alternative that they were trying to build. And for me, there's a lot in your book around, the governance, the economic structures, the ways in some of the ways in which, as you just also pointed to, some of the ways in which the kind of sectarianism was, or the efforts to overcome some of the sectarianism. But what particularly struck me was the part about education. And there's an excerpt from your book, and the chapter opens with someone called Shirin Hemo and talking about the education system. And she describes growing up without knowing that Armenians, Syriacs, and other groups even existed in Syria. And you also talk about how the autonomous administration made creating a new curriculum one of its primary goals, and the way in which the approach to that, as we know as well, wasn't just about adding another language or other languages, but actually rethinking pedagogically what education should be in the name of transforming society. So I think, yeah, and therefore to like reconstruct its education system, particularly also I think during wartime. All this was happening, as we know, at the same time as the territorial fight against the so-called Islamic State. Why do you think, or do you think education is and should be one of the central parts of negotiation with the new central Syrian government or administration in Damascus? And do you think, and maybe this question gets a bit too broad, but do you think the kind of the alternative education system being also proposed by the STF and the STC also affects some of the developments that we're seeing between Turkey and the Kurds on the other side of the border, and and Turkey's vision for the future of Syria too?
Right. So those are a lot of questions. So I will say that yes, during my first visit to Kobani in again June 2015, before the SDF had even been created, the first thing they actually wanted to show me, and I had told them I'm coming here to do a survey of the YPJ. They were like, okay, but first we want to take you and show you our school. I was like, okay, sure, why not? I came all this way, show me the school. And so they took me to a container. It was literally, a container because so many of the buildings in Kobani had been destroyed. So they had like a metal or aluminum container, and that was their school. And again, this was in June, so it was in the summer, it was very hot, but there were kids, sitting there going to school in the summer, learning Kurdish. And they were so proud of this. And, that they had created a school in the midst of this destroyed city. And that illustrated to me that this was a priority for them, because we know from many conflicts around the world, sadly, often, one of the first victims is that the kids stop going to school, right? I mean, that because of the destruction of the infrastructure, or it's simply too risky for them to travel to get to the schools. And so they really were putting a high importance on making sure that the children were allowed to continue their education even in the midst of this brutal conflict. And so that was the first. I mean, just the fact they were continuing education at all, it was, a significant, I think, achievement. And the second thing, of course, is that the fact that they introduced the Kurdish language, which had been banned in Syria. And so they were, providing instruction in Kurdish, in Kobani. The Syriac and Assyrian minority, they also began providing instruction in Aramaic or Syriac, which is the language spoken by Jesus. It's an ancient language that is actually teetering on the brink of extinction. And so for this Syriac and Assyrian Christian minority, their priority was also to make sure their language does not go extinct. And so, the fact that you had both of these minorities who, saw this as a priority for themselves to the, language instruction and the education system the new education system that they started to create, um, this also is in line with recommendations by the UN that children actually have a right to instruction in their mother tongue, and that it's more cost effective if students have education in their mother tongue. It reduces dropout rates, especially among girls. And so you have, the United Nations, UNICEF advocating for instruction in the mother tongue. And that's exactly what they've done in the Northeast, the Kurds and also the Syriac and Assyrian minority. And yet, sadly, this education system that they've created, in my view, has not received the support that it should receive. They are, it's something that I think, again, many people are not even aware of because of the lack of understanding of Northeast Syria and the governance structures that they've created. But I hope that the chapter in my book where I wrote about the education system, not just in again in the Kurdish or for the Christian minorities, but also in places like Manbij, Tapka, and elsewhere. Uh, I hope that this will help draw attention to this issue and that they will get the support that they deserve because it is, as you mentioned, it is one of the key issues that they are negotiating now, the autonomous administration in Northeast Syria with the interim government in Damascus. Um, it's also important to point out that the new education minister, Dr. Mohammed Turko, he's actually a Kurd from Afrin. And so those negotiations between the interim government in Damascus and the Northeast are ongoing. And it's an area where, again, it's really vital for all students in Syria to be able to continue their education. Otherwise, we risk losing an entire generation of young people in Syria if we can't get them back to school.
Yeah, and I think the way the education system is set up, all the actors are very aware that it also has an impact on the future of Syria in terms of, I suppose, kind of how certain political and ideological and also social thinking is encouraged, and therefore the kind of basis in which society is built on. And despite many, despite, over a decade of conflict, actually, if you look at it, Syria does have quite a young population, and therefore the education system is particularly important. Um, Another another really it seems important point of negotiation between the interim government and Northeast Syria, but also that you've also referred to in your talks and also in other places is how the autonomous administration came to control two-thirds of Syria's resources while holding about one-third of its territory. And I know you and others often, when you refer to this, it's to demonstrate the kind of the ability that the autonomous administration is able to do this. But I was thinking about this, and it seems to reveal I think something a bit more profound. We also know that under the Ba'ath regime, under the Assad regime, the north of the country was, seen or treated as like the breadbasket of Syria, in that most of the wheat was grown there, but actually refined and used predominantly in other parts of Syria. So, with this awareness as well, or with this reality, it seems, it reveals something more profound about how resources were distributed or withheld under the Ba'ath regime in terms of the other resources as well, whether it's like oil, gas, and other, and obviously agriculture as well. You know, I was thinking about this, and also the knowledge of like the Armenian genocide's connection to this geography. What do you continue or what continuities do you see in how states and empires have approached minority populations and their resources? And what can you say about the importance of how resources are shared for the future of Syria?
Right, those are excellent questions, and I guess I'll start out with the, historical dimension of your question about the Armenian genocide. So the reason why Northeast Syria is as diverse as it is, with Kurds, Arabs, Syriac Christians, Armenians, etc., is in part because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian genocide in 1915, when the Armenian population inside Turkey was forced on death marches into what is now Syria, including places like Aleppo, but also Ras Al Ain, or Serikane as it's known in Kurdish, and as far south as Deir ez-Zor. And so northeast Syria begins geographically where the death marches in 1915 ended during the Armenian genocide. And so you really have to, understand that history to understand why this is such a diverse region. And uh, scholars such as Seda Altu have written about how the essentially those who were deemed undesirable by the Ottoman Empire and then the early Turkish Republic were forced into what is now Syria, or fled in some cases into northern Syria after, for example, the Sheikh Said rebellion, or the Mount Ararat Rebellion, which I wrote about I dedicated a whole chapter of my book to the Ararat Rebellion because I found that, I was trying to explain how is it possible that this region of Northeast Syria has, this coalition between the Kurdish and Christian minority that has, very few people had written about actually, and that it's been also so, that it sustained itself throughout this conflict. And I saw a precedent in the Mount Ararat Rebellion, which, in my view, was one of the most significant rebellions after the founding of the Turkish Republic. There were, depending on who you ask, some dozen to 15 or more rebellions actually after the founding of the Turkish Republic, like the Dersim Rebellion, Sheikh Said, Kochgiri, etc. And the Ararat Rebellion, in my view, was so significant because it was based on an official treaty of collaboration between Kurds and Armenians. So Armenians in the Dashnak Sutyun and Kurds in the Khoybun, who signed this treaty of collaboration in Lebanon, actually, in 1927, and then declared the Mount Ararat Republic in eastern Turkey, now on the border to Armenia. And this lasted for about 7 years before it was violently crushed. And again, after that rebellion was crushed, the participants in the rebellion escaped, some into Syria, some into Iraq, Iran, etc. But this, I dedicated a chapter in my book to this because I think it's important to understand this history, and also that I see the Mount Ararat Republic as in some ways a precedent for what's happening in Northeast Syria. Um, and I also, again, believe that we have to understand these migration and flows and the forced displacement that happened, that's gone back again to the Armenian genocide and continues until today in these borderlands. Um, but your question about the resources, um, in the course of the fight against the Islamic State, it was ISIS actually that controlled those oil resources. And I think the World Bank at one point during the war estimated that that's why Daesh, the Islamic State, was the richest terrorist organization in the world, because they took control of oil resources in both Syria and Iraq. And then as the SDF defeated the Islamic State, they assumed control of those oil resources. However, a lot of that infrastructure is still destroyed until today. And so they have to use very basic, primitive, underdeveloped means of extracting the oil, which is causing a health crisis. Um, and so, the question of how that infrastructure will be rebuilt, I think, will be key to the economic development of Syria, which is, desperately needed now. More than 90% of the population in Syria as a whole lives under the poverty line. And so there's a real economic crisis now in Syria, and making sure that the oil resources and the agricultural resources can all be harnessed is essential.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I think these are obviously really, really important questions, and obviously all are dependent on how the negotiations and the talks between the interim government and the autonomous administration proceed. So, in September 2025, so recently, the Ahmed al-Sharaa, so the interim president of Syria, was in New York to address the UN. And, looking at this, I think the initial thought is that he really has had quite a remarkable trajectory from Al-Qaeda to Daesh, also known as the so-called Islamic State, from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to now the Syrian president speaking at the UN, and with him describing his prior affiliations to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell shortly after he took power as merely gaining experience as a young man. And we also saw quite a remarkable scene as well in September 2025, where former CIA Director David Petraeus, who arrested Jolani in 2006, interviewed him and said, "We hope for your success, inshallah. Your success is our success." I mean, what do you have to say about all of this? And there was also a lot of suggestions from different areas. Obviously, none of these have been fully confirmed by the actual authorities, but that there has been suggestions that Jolani, also known as Ahmed al-Sharaa, was being prepared for this or was being trained for this for, up to a year before he took power by certain British think tanks. So it seems like all of this has been a great rehabilitation of this man's image to prepare him either, I mean, we don't know, but either to actually stay in power in Syria or to get the concessions that they need, in terms of certain Western powers. I mean, what do you have to say about all of this? Also, in the context where there's pressures on the SDF to make a deal with Jolani. Very early on, the German foreign minister called for the SDF to disarm, and they seem to have now dropped that or like softened that. What do you have to say about all of this?
Right. Well, you'll have to ask the British think tanks, I think, and perhaps the intelligence community in the UK what exactly they did in the prior, years grooming Jolani into Ahmad al-Sharaa. They would be the experts on that, not me. But yes, it's quite a transformation from, he was essentially an Al-Qaeda offshoot sent to Syria. Um, he was imprisoned in the Al-Buqa notorious prison in Iraq by the United States, by the Americans at the time. And then he was released in 2011. Um, so, his history as a former Al-Qaeda leader is well known. Now, I would say that I do believe people can change. I do believe that. But the question of whether he has, in fact, changed and become less of an extremist will have to be judged by his actions, not just by his words. I'll give one example. When I traveled to Syria after the fall of the regime in December, and at that time, Ahmed al-Sharaa, had visited and met with leaders of various Christian churches in Damascus, and they took a photo together. And that was sort of, I think it was around Christmas time. Literally one day later, or maybe 2 days later, his, at the time, education minister put out a statement about the school curriculum in Syria, whereby they announced that they were going to remove references to the quote, injustices of the Ottoman period, remove that from the curriculum. So they wouldn't be taught about the injustice of the Ottoman period anymore. And that Jews and Christians would be referred to as those who had gone astray from the true faith. So if you look at the photo of Ahmad al-Sharaa with the Christian priests, and then what they were actually, saying they were going to do in terms of the school curriculum to teach about Jewish and Christians, in Syria, it's diametrically opposed, right? And so that's why I would urge everyone who's paying attention now, don't just look at what they say, look at what they do. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you know, Syrians, of course, and I experienced this myself. I saw it myself back in December and January, soon after the fall of the regime. There is a euphoria in the country, understandably, after more than half a century of rule by the dynasty, first Hafez al-Assad, then Bashar al-Assad. Of course, there's a euphoria that he's gone now, and the fact that the Russian and Iranian influence has been diminished is also really a historic turning point. And some have, compared this to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it's really not just the collapse of one regime, but really a geopolitical reordering of the entire Middle East. And so there is a potential for, a new future in Syria that may also lead the region in a better direction. Um, but we've seen what's happened since, again, in the last 9 months since the fall of the regime, that instead of Russia and Iran being the two dominant external powers propping up the Assad regime, we now have Turkey and Israel, who are both also vying for influence. And I think in many ways, their interests are also diametrically opposed to each other in Syria now. So I think to some extent, the US is trying to play somewhat of a mediating role in this complex environment. But I would again, and one of the sort of two landmark decisions since the fall of the regime was the agreement in March between Ahmad al-Sharaa and the SDF commander Muslim Abdi, that they should integrate their forces. And there were a number of other points of that agreement. In that agreement, there was no mention of women, although women comprise approximately 30% of the SDF, at the height of the fight against the Islamic State. And so, there's clearly a lot of points of that agreement that have not yet been worked out. And that, if they want to actually integrate these forces, there needs to be some consideration for women. And minorities who are also have played leading roles in the SDF. So in some ways, this agreement in March raises more questions than answers. But I think that the interim government has approached the SDF and the Autonomous Administration as maybe not as equals, but they recognize that they are powerful. Whereas they've approached the Druze minority in the south and the Alawites in the coastal areas, they see them as weak, and as that's why I believe they've engaged in horrific violence and massacres in an attempt to forcibly assert control over Suwaida in the south, and the coastal areas in the west. And so this is, the staggering violence, I think, has been obviously a huge concern to many people, and it will, we'll have to see how things unfold in the coming months, but that's where we are now.
I mean, you said that you see the role or you think that the role the US is trying to play is like almost as a mediator between the interests of Turkey and Israel in the context of Syria. I mean, you worked at the State Department also on Syria, on Turkey, and on Iraq. From that perspective, and I'm sure, obviously State Departments change and transform and so on, but in terms of the kind of like thinking or like the approach to this, do you is there a way that it is actually a mediation role? What are the interests of the US? Like, what do the US want to see in Syria? Because there was a lot of suggestions, or a lot of the analysis would suggest that for for the longest time, the US, even though it created certain skirmishes between themselves and Turkey, they stayed in support of the SDF in Syria, not necessarily out of goodwill. These are some of the suggestions, but as a way to not hand Syria entirely to the hands of Russia. What do you think that's still a similar interest? Obviously, now Russia is basically out of Syria. What does the US want to see? Because I imagine it's not merely a mediation role that they want to play.
So this agreement that was made in March, again, that was an important, I think, step towards integration. Sadly, the interim government seems to see that agreement now as just a way to pressure the SDF to disarm, as opposed to fulfilling the other aspects of the agreement, which are necessary for confidence building measures and all the other things they have to agree on. And the SDF, has asked, okay, you want us to integrate into the new Syrian army? What Syrian army? There actually is no, unified command structure of this new Syrian army. There are a bunch of different militias that are, they're trying to integrate them, but they're not yet. It's not yet a unified army. President Trump met with Ahmad al-Sharaa in the spring. The US lifted or removed Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, from its FTO list, foreign terrorist organization list. And the new special envoy, who was appointed in May, Thomas Barak, who's also the US ambassador to Turkey, he's also the special envoy in Syria. Um, he has said he said in July that the US had complete confidence in the interim government. He even compared Ahmad al-Sharaa to George Washington. Uh, and a few days later is when the violence erupted in Sueda, when the interim authorities tried to reestablish or reassert or assert, I would say for the first time, control over Sueda. Um, as a pretext, there had been they used the fact that there were some clashes between Bedouin tribes and the Druze militias. In any case, many believe that those comments by the U.S. Special Envoy may have encouraged the interim government to take those measures because they felt that the U.S., had their back, or somehow that was meant as a green light. And I'm quite sure that was obviously not the case. But recently, some of the comments that the U.S. Special Envoy has made, uh, you know, I think are more balanced. And so it seems that there's a recognition that we need to truly be balanced in this, effort to mediate, because otherwise the situation could spiral easily out of control. And there's really deep distrust amongst the Druze community, and also amongst the Alawite community, and also amongst the Christian minority, including in Damascus, where there was a suicide bombing at the Mar Elias church um, over the summer. And so, many of these minorities are truly fearful, and also moderate Sunnis of the interim government. And it's worth pointing out that members of the former regime, including military officers who defected, right, from the Syrian regime, they have reportedly also not been, there's been no outreach to them to try to bring them back, even though they defected from the regime. Many technocrats who worked in the bureaucracy, for example, in the government in Damascus, were simply let go, and they are not getting any salaries. And these are just like ordinary Syrians who were not responsible for the atrocities of the Assad regime, but they've been let go. And so, I've seen myself how devastated this country is. It needs to be rebuilt. And in order to rebuild the country, they need every single Syrian to be able to pitch in and contribute their expertise, including women, men, Christians, Muslims, Kurds, Druze, Alawis, etc. And so they need to take an inclusive approach, but instead they're doing the opposite. They're taking an exclusive approach and excluding people. The interim government is, whereas the autonomous administration has tried to be as inclusive as possible in areas that it governs. Now, sadly, again, many people in the international community are still unaware of the governance structures that have been created in the Northeast. But, I hope that my book and other reports and articles about the region will highlight the fact that there is actually a model inside Syria that could be used in this crucial transitional period. Because some international experts have been lining up and say, oh, look at Bosnia, look at Rwanda, look at, follow these other models of other countries that went through, conflicts, and how they post-conflict transition periods. And yes, I am all in favor of learning from other countries and experiences, but there is a model inside Syria that should be studied and potentially replicated in this critical transition period if you are looking for a model of inclusive governance. Um,
And I mean, even some years ago, particularly after the fight against the so-called Islamic State in Kobane, US officials at the time were also acknowledging that, the administration in Northeast Syria were governing in their wake. So against many odds, actually, that they have built these structures, and that doesn't mean that they might not need, it doesn't mean that they can't be critiqued. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. But perhaps it could be a model. I want to go back to what you said about the agreement between Muslim Abdi and Ahmad al-Sharaa made in March, and that, women were missing from this. Now, shortly after that, the YPJ, which obviously, still exists as an autonomous defense unit that is affiliated to the SDF but maintains its autonomy, said that disarming is a red line for them and that they will never do it. So meaning that obviously we don't know the exact talks or what the discussions were behind the scenes, but there is a chance that Muslim Abdi would not have put forward some of the elements about women because he essentially may have been told that you can't do that without us present, and that disarming or integrating into a central army is a red line for us.
um, the upcoming parliamentary elections that will be now held in October, I believe, exclude Hasaka, Raqqa, and also Suwaida. So they've officially basically said that those elections will not take place there. And the so-called elections have also been criticized because 1/3 of the seats are going to be directly appointed by Ahmad al-Sharaa, and 2/3 of the seats are going to be indirectly appointed through a committee that he also appoints the members of. So these, elections have been also criticized as not actually elections, but more of a sort of top-down appointment process, and also that they're not going to be taking place even in parts of the Northeast and in Suwaida. But so I think that just pointing to these deficiencies is important, but also learning lessons from other countries around the world where we know that having an inclusive transition period and an inclusive governance structure is one of the things that can help prevent conflict relapse, because often the conflict emerges from exclusion because people felt that they were not included in the prior government under the Assad regime. And that systematic exclusion of people is one of the drivers of the conflict. And so that is one of the things that absolutely needs to be overcome now. And that's, why I think there needs to be, again, more focus on, the diversity of Syria, but also the fact that de facto the country has, there's a lot of talk about decentralization, or what type of government should the future of Syria take? Should it be, a centralized system, a decentralized system, local autonomy? And this is something for Syrians to determine themselves. We know also, again, learning from cross-national literature, that the Middle East is the part of the region of the world that has the lowest levels of democratization. It also has the lowest levels of decentralization. And so, there's possibly a correlation here, right? Where in other regions of the world, like in both in Europe, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a recognition that decentralization contributes to greater fiscal responsibility, for example. And it allows local communities to make decisions about how they want to spend their own budget. And so this understanding that decentralization can facilitate, it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean that automatically democracy is going to sort of spring forth, but that a decentralized system could also help facilitate greater democratization in Syria over time.
And I think, as you said as well, the involvement of women is crucial to that. And, I wanted to ask you how to be able to even start that process, YPG, Congressar, and the women's structures in the Northeast, obviously, in a way, need to have counterparts. But when we look at the interim government, there's basically no meaningful women's presence, or no meaningful women's political presence. How, how could the process of these negotiations proceed if an entire section of society don't have a counterpart to have these negotiations with?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The so Hind Kabawat is the only woman who's in the new interim government. She's also the only Christian. She's one of the ministers for the Minister for Labor and Social Affairs. Um, I will point out that there is another example of a local agreement that I think is potentially a success story that could be, seen as a model that could be replicated for other local agreements, because these negotiations are happening again, as we talked about before, between the interim government and the Northeast. But there are also agreements and negotiations in Aleppo. So Aleppo, it was actually the largest city in Syria before the conflict. Now, because of displacement, it's the second largest city in Syria. But in April, there was an agreement in Aleppo between the two Kurdish neighborhoods of Sheikh Maksud and Ashrafia and the parts of the city that are held by the interim government. And I actually interviewed the two, both the woman Hevin Suleiman and her male counterpart, who negotiated this agreement and signed it with the interim government, where they were able to find a compromise, whereby the YPG forces withdrew from the city of Aleppo, and instead you had the Asayish and the internal security forces that maintain control were allowed in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Maksud and Ashrafia. But one of the sticking points was the question of gender, and that the interim government said we don't want women and men to be, for example, at the same shared checkpoints. And the Kurdish side was able to agree that at the shared checkpoints between the Kurdish forces or the Asayish and the interim government forces, women would not be present at the shared checkpoints, but inside the Kurdish neighborhoods, women could continue to do essentially everything they did before as part of the Asayish and internal security forces. So I'm just mentioning this as one example of how they were able to compromise and find an agreement in Aleppo that was reached peacefully. And after that Aleppo agreement was signed, there were celebrations in the city of Aleppo, and there were fireworks. And, so I think, but women were part of those negotiations. They weren't just part of the negotiations, they were signatories to the agreement. From the Kurdish side, there were no women on the interim government side. But this is an example of a locally mediated ceasefire agreement that was successful. And so that's why I would like to still be optimistic about the future of Syria, and that other parts of Syria could potentially follow that model of the Aleppo agreement moving forward.
Yeah, and I think yeah, and I think as you've said as well, there's, hope and belief is very important in these processes, and we hope to see a prosperous and progressive Syria. The final question I wanted to ask you, which I think is really relevant to everything we've discussed, whether people kind of make those connections or not, is obviously a big uh, a big actor in the future. Well, in terms of the developments in Syria until now, but also for the future of Syria is obviously the Turkish state. Now, those who have followed the politics of the region, and particularly the politics of the Turkish state, are aware that the the levels or the forms of Kurdish organization is a very big sticking point for the Turkish state. But we also are seeing the suggestions of a possible peace process between the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Turkish state. what do you see, what do you have to say about this possible peace process, and what implications do you think it will have on the future of Syria too?
I think we are truly at a historic moment because of the fall of the Assad regime, which we've been talking about, but also the fact that we have this, peace process in Turkey, or negotiation process that is happening in Turkey regarding the PKK. Um, and I think that we all need to think very carefully moving forward about how to perhaps, make sure that these two processes are, aligned, or that one process doesn't act as a spoiler for the other. Um, the the Turkish authorities have said publicly things, for example, about the SDF, in the past, claiming that the SDF was, a major threat to Turkey. When even saying, some Turkish officials claimed that the SDF was as big of a threat to Turkey as the Islamic State, for example. Now, we know that, was not actually true. In fact, the opposite was true, because the SDF defeated the Islamic State and thereby actually protected Turkey from the Islamic State. So not only was the SDF not a threat to Turkey, it actually protected Turkey. And Turkish officials privately would recognize that. And I think this peace process now is perhaps in recognition of this new situation. And you know, so on the one hand, the I hope that this, again, the process will move forward. But we also see that Turkey continues to try to influence what's happening in Syria, the so-called Syrian National Army that was created and funded by Turkey, where they took the former, opposition, the armed opposition in Syria, some of those groups, and they trained them and turned them into this Syrian National Army. Officially, that Syrian National Army, SNA, has been dissolved, but in reality, they still operate. I visited Afrin over the summer. For the first time. It wasn't possible to visit before, and I saw myself how some of the Turkish, armed factions, like the Sultan Murad, the Hamza Division, etc., Ahrar Shakia, they're still operating there in Afrin. And reportedly, those military commanders still have meetings with Turkish officials without Damascus. And so it's somewhat ironic that Turkey is pressuring, the SDF to disarm, pressuring the Druze to disarm, but they still have their own, military units that are operating, that they haven't disarmed, and they're still functioning essentially as Turkish proxy forces in Syria. Now, one of the interesting questions is, will Turkey be able to maintain its control over these proxy forces? Or, because some of those proxy forces in Afrin have actually left Afrin, and they've joined supposedly joined the new Syrian army, or they've gone back to wherever they're from in southern parts of southern Syria, right? Because those were people who were not from Afrin originally. And so when the regime fell, it was for them the first time they could actually go back to their families or their hometowns. And so, there's an interesting dynamic going on whereby it seems that Turkey is trying to maintain its control over these proxy forces, but at the same time, these are, individuals who want to go back to their homes and families wherever they're from. They don't want to stay there in Afrin when that's a part of the country they're not originally from. And so they may now also genuinely want to help rebuild Syria. I mean, if they're, so there's, I think, potentially an opportunity there to look at how, again, in this transition period where the cement is not yet set, let's say, right, that we should try to move forward, with caution, but also understand the possibilities and the challenges that lie ahead.
Thank you very much, Amy. This was a really, really interesting and enlightening conversation. And I'm sure we could have spoken for hours, and I'm sure there'll be more conversations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. As I said at the beginning, we're a grassroots funded organization, and so your support really helps us keep going. Follow us at theamargi.com and on our socials to stay connected, and let's keep piecing together the mosaic. Until next time, take care.